as you start to join, welcome to Coffee and Conversions. This is actually our first Coffee and Conversions event so far in 2022, and we are so thrilled to welcome our rockstar panel guest from TalkWalker, Dell Technologies, and Oracle. Thank you so much for joining. Feel free to engage with each other in the chat as well as questions start to come up as we start to go through all the different cool topics we're going to be discussing today. Please feel free to ask your questions directly to our panelists, to me, and I'll be sure to try and get those out and covered as we move along. So without any further ado, I am going to go ahead and kick things off. For people that are new to Coffee and Conversions is a networking community for marketers, by marketers. We put on events either, we try to do it as often as we can. This year, we're probably looking at maybe 6 across 2022 that we have on the schedule, covering all sorts of topics from data and technology to out-of-home marketing to brand strategy trends. What are the concerns or challenges that marketers are trying to overcome and face today? And our job here is really to bring that conversation to the table and bring experts to the table to talk about what they're doing to overcome those challenges. Which brings us to today, data and technology in 2022. I am thrilled to welcome our guest panelists. We have Alban from TalkWalker, we have Angelia from Dell Technologies, and Joe Frick from Oracle. Team, welcome. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
I would love for you guys to introduce yourselves, talk about your roles at your current organizations, and take it away. Joe, do you want to get started?
Sure. Hi, everybody. And first, let me just say what a pleasure it is to be part of this experience, this panel, and this program, because it's excellent. And if our pregame call was any indication, it's going to be a good chat. I'm Joe Frick. I'm the head of partnership development for the Data First team within Oracle Advertising. New York area based for my entire career, pushing the edge of 30 years now. I was actually doing the calculation, and I am just looking forward to a really good conversation today.
Me too. Angelia.
Angelia McFarland, Dell Technologies. I manage product marketing for our networking portfolio, also programs and operations across our enterprise portfolio. Similar to Joe, I've been in the technology for a long time, and lady doesn't tell her age, so I'm not going to say how long, Joe, but but you'll probably figure out as we go through, you'll figure out how long I've been in. But just really excited about what's happening in technology now. And in addition to my work at Dell, I also do a lot of research and conversations on the side and where these technologies are going from a marketing perspective.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your insights today, Angelia. And Alban, let's tell me a little bit about yourself and your company. We're excited to have you on today.
Thanks, Meg. Hi, everyone. I'm Alban Flamont from TalkWalker. So I'm the head of brand and data storytelling at TalkWalker, which is a consumer intelligence company. But maybe to give you a bit more on my background, I'm not a marketer by training by any means. I have a mixed background in law, journalism, and international relations. But in that mix, basically, I got really interested in data and how basically private company were working with data and leveraging as much value as possible out of it. That's how I found TalkWalker. Super interested. Super excited to participate into that panel, and hopefully everybody can understand, my accent and all of that, joining you from Europe.
Yeah, we have gone global, folks. Let it be known here, Coffee and Conversions has expanded beyond the Atlantic. Alban, thank you so much for joining us. So as we kick off today, attendees, I would love for you to kind of consider what you're doing at your own companies right now around data and technology. What are the concerns that you're having? What are the challenges or the anticipated challenges that you're seeing in the forefront kind of coming at you? And keep that in mind as we start going through today's conversation. Today, I want to kind of lay out the landscape of what that looks like in 2022. And Angelia, from your perspective, I would be very curious to see what your considerations are around big brand landscape today and how data and technology has really formed that. what advice, from my perspective, I've seen a lot of brand side and agency side marketers experiencing a lot of rapid growth right now. And a lot of that is due to the advancements in data and technology. So what advice would you give them today as this landscape continues to evolve?
My advice would be, I like the word that you used, Meg, which was evolution. Data's been around for us for a very long time. And as marketers, what we tend to do with the data is we tend to, the data and the technology. So the technology enables more data, all right? It enables us to process more data, enables us to collect more data. And so they kind of go hand in hand, which is why I like the way that you titled this session. What we tend to do is as these capabilities come on board, we take what we were doing in the past and we say, okay, how can I do it differently with either this technology or this data? Or how can I do it better with this technology and this data? I think that what's happening now is it's time for us to begin to reframe and say, okay, I have this technology and this data. Let's start with a blank piece of paper. If I didn't know about brochures and webinars and all of these things that we do to get our messages out, how would I leverage this technology and this data that I have to drive a marketing objective? And a lot of times we don't have time to do that. In the spaces where we do, I believe that's going to be an important thing for us to do as marketers. And the people who have the time to do that and the people who do that are going to find that they're going to hit the market first and they're going to get competitive advantage in coming up with the next new best thing.
100%. And I think that's a really refreshing way to look at it. We depend so heavily on the systems and the technology stacks that we have in place. Right. How can we kind of push ourselves further if all of that has to change at the drop of the hat? Alban, from your experience, how has data changed the way that marketers tend to communicate with their customers right now? From your perspective, you have all of this technology that really kind of emphasizes, perspective. And I would love to know what you have seen, if you have seen any examples of how big brands have actually won when they use data to tell the story the right way.
I would say that today businesses tend to join data, and especially marketers. We have so much data at our disposal and we're not too sure what to do with it. So I think that's really the struggle. And at the same time, obviously we've had the pandemic roll through. So we're liking a bit more of that physical proximity with the consumer in a sense. And so the big challenge for marketer, I think, is to actually find ways to leverage data they have around them, and making the most of it to be, again, consumer close. And we do see a lot of brands looking for that right now, trying to understand what their customers are going through, when they're failing them sometimes, because that happens. I was just reading a super interesting article from PwC on a study about micro failures. So brands tend to know a lot about big failures, in customer experience, but there's all like these micro moments where people are not so happy with the brand. And it's actually really hard to capture if you're not really listening for it. And if you don't have like the right climate to actually get your customers to tell you when it didn't work so well for them, so you can improve that experience. So I think that today brands are really looking for ways to understand, the consumer journey, to be a bit cliche there. I'm thinking of one of our clients that works in the spirit sector. So, everything linked to, they want to understand how people party today. What's the path to party, in a sense? Understand all the different ways, what, where, and when people consume their products, consume their brand, in a sense, and how they can actually be present in these moments, with as much empathy, as much knowledge as possible. So again, it's that proximity aspect that's really important. I think that's what data should be at the end of the day, a way to be more human, to be closer to consumer.
We've had this conversation and we touched on it a little bit in our pre-game session that Joe mentioned earlier. Us as marketers really almost innately understand, the data points and the technology and how that's connecting, and, why brands are engaging with us on a personal level the way that they are. But to put our human hat on and really experience it as the consumer, I don't know how, I think that's becoming more important as we start to breathe in empathy. Which leads me to Joe, and I know that you have a really good opinion about this. As we start to leverage all of the data that's out there, all of the data that's available today, you know, we talked about this, first party data is becoming so much more important than it ever was before. How would you advise brands to really leverage their existing data assets, and especially based on the landscape today and all of the things that are changing in terms of data collection and integrations and use? What advice would you give to brands that are doing that now?
It's interesting because data and technology for marketers is so complementary now. And I've had the pleasure of kind of observing the development simultaneously over the years. And what occurs to me is the fact that we now can fulfill the sort of promise that marketers have always been striving for in myriad ways. You know, in the direct response world, this is sort of the part and parcel in the business I came up in. And I see representatives who logged in to see this today from that world, which is just awesome. So nice to see all of you. But I think we now can deliver that one-to-one connection at a fairly intimate level. And so what ends up happening is brands need to create the circumstances where they can, I like the term, investigate their first-party data. You know, they're in a very conspicuous relationship with their customers. And I think with the development of the technology, we now have the ability as stewards of that customer data, and it's something I want to return to a little bit later as we spin this out, to be responsible to those individuals whose data we are stewarding, who are kind of granting us the right to possess. So I think with that trust and that obligation as marketers, our job is really to investigate that first party data to build the understanding. As Alban said, meeting consumers in the moment now is actually attainable at a lot of levels and in a variety of ways because of technology. And so what we need to be very careful about as we go about the investigation, that the consumers are part of the conversation so they understand what us as brands investigating the data actually means to them. And I think that's really where this leverages. So an abidance of caution and care and respect for the entities that are sharing data with us. But really, my advice is to build out the structures, you know, at every level for an organization to be able to investigate that data, understand customer journey. The delivery, the promise and the delivery of an exceptional customer experience is certainly within a brand's reach. And it starts with a real investigation of that first party data to understand how the consumers behave. And just know as a brand, you're entrusted with this by virtue of notice and consent. And I think that's super important.
Hey, Meg, can I jump in here quickly
Yeah.
and just articulate both what Alban and Joe talked about are capabilities that from a technology perspective weren't possible. Like micro failures, we didn't have the technology to either gather the data for a micro failure and or process it. 5-7 years ago, it was data that was there, but we couldn't capture it, and we absolutely couldn't process it fast enough to actually respond. And the same thing with what Joe was talking about, first party data. We could get it, but it was a person-to-person thing, right? You had to have somebody standing in the mall with a clipboard. I remember that was one of my first jobs, with the clipboard saying, "Hey, what do you think about this? What do you think about that?" And now we can gather that data passively, right? Once we get permission from a customer, we can passively gather that data from them, and then have the ability to process it. And so those are the types of things that are different in this industry now, that give us the ability to rethink the way that we're doing things.
And if I may, I think at the same time, we also have to be very conscious, you know, because it's really tempting to just gather more and more and more and more data, but you have to be very deliberate as to what you do it, why you're doing it, you know, and if it's really serving, you know, a purpose at the end of the day. Because in the end, it's back to, okay, what am I trying to achieve? You know, what can I know about the consumer, and maybe not go too far as well, as Joe mentioned, because I think it's a big question even when it comes to AI and the type of data we can collect today. How far do we actually want to go?
It really, that's why I like the idea of investigating data, because an investigation yields a set of possible paths. And I think technology and data combined lets us do proper investigation to understand precisely within the bounds of this consent and this relationship with the consumer. The one-to-one relationship in terms of a brand in the commercial sense is equally important to the one-to-one relationship with a brand and their consumer with respect to their data and their PII specifically, if we're calling, I'm confining it to that for this, but investigation is a really powerful term, because I do think a big pile of data needs some kind of a curation level so that there's something useful on the other side of it. And I think investigation is that process by which collect mountains of data, but make it actionable, meaningful, and more importantly, relevant. The outcomes then become relevant to the prospective customers and current customers, and considering customer acquisition and retention efforts, especially relevant as a brand considers strategies to continue to drive those efforts.
And going back to the limits. So obviously we've never had, as much access to data as before, but at the same time, even within organizations, we still have silos between departments. We're still not communicating the best way. There's some info in the customer success department, there's some info in the sales teams that never gets to marketing. And right now we're not that good still, I think, at communicating the data across departments and actually like funneling the insights that we find across the organization.
That's a very good point, and a conversation that I've had with a lot of companies that are trying to not necessarily blend their marketing and sales teams together, but also really trying to create a backwards funnel from sales to marketing. It's usually marketing to sales, because that's how the message has to get out there, through our sales teams. But as we go back a little bit to data collection and the exchange of data, the amount of accessible, like what Angelia was talking about before, the passive ways that we're collecting data with that exchange, that promise to the consumer, give me your information and I'm going to return this back to you. Because that's become so much more passive, and because there's almost so much more we're able to collect and so much more we're able to do as marketers with that information, does it now become a conversation of what should we be doing with that data? How far should we be pushing those boundaries? The data ethics that come behind that. I know we talked about this before, right? The Spider-Man quote, with great power comes great responsibility. So, Joe, I'm just curious, for marketers, what advice would you give to marketing leaders that have all the tools that they've developed, the technology that they've developed to send these hyper-personalized campaigns as they become more sophisticated? How do they then turn that into how to help people versus just getting that marketing message out?
Sure. I mean, it starts with a very clear purpose of collecting data. Notice and disclosure is so crucial now. I mean, when you consider the IAPP keeps a weekly running total of how the privacy landscape is changing at the state level, because presently there have been a few congresspersons who have advanced kind of national legislation at various tempos and with various provisions that have gotten battered around Congress, and then they sort of fade and then they sort of return. But in fact, at the state level, there's a lot of action happening right now. And I do believe, as of last week, I think IAPP's total for states that have a privacy law, a local privacy law for residents of those states, there were over 30. So this is a fairly fragmented landscape. Arguably, based on what I've observed, there'll be some consistency about what notice and disclosure actually means. So getting to the point specifically about how a brand goes to market and brings that customer really into a conversation, consumer first, prospect first, with that sort of initial handshake where there's a consent for marketing. And I do think it boils down to technology accompanying this idea of clear notice and disclosure about data collected. I mean, in very simple, plain language, because I do think that, technology is now more than utility. It's become an extension of our lives and practically, essential infrastructure for most of us to interact with the world. I mean, every aspect, from travel to commerce, certainly the one-click Amazon resolution and get a product delivered in certain urban areas in an hour. I mean, this is a wild time. And with that, we just have a really good opportunity as representatives of the data community to kind of make sure that this idea that the consumers, customers at large are part of the conversation, understanding what this transaction actually entails in a very clear and upfront way. As technology continues to move forward, I would challenge you, Angelia, 5 to 7 years ago, I would say 6 to 12 months ago, certain paradigms in data collection have changed. The pace is staggering, and we need to come sort of together as an industry, as marketers in general, to make sure that notice and disclosure, it's an essential part of delivering the exceptional customer journey. Aside from the journey and the commercial aspect itself, that communication with the customer and the consumer and the intended consumer is critical. Clear notice and disclosure in very plain language about data collected, with whom it's shared, how it's shared, and an opportunity to opt out of that sharing if a consumer so desires to do so.
Absolutely. Angelia, I know you've got a lot to build on this as well.
I know. I also want to highlight, and in our pre-read, we talked a lot about data civics, and the conversation that Joe just had about giving consumers all of these capabilities. I really think that in school we need to add either to the civics curriculum or add a date, or to the technology curriculum or its own curriculum, this data civics curriculum, because we can provide all of those things. But if customers don't really understand what they mean, because in the industry, we throw around all kinds, PII, we throw around all these terms. The average consumer doesn't understand what those terms mean. And so they can, the consent statements are pretty clear, but most people are not reading. I mean, how many people get in the mail at least once a week, somebody's changed their privacy policy and it's 4 pages long. And I'm like, I'm not reading that. Right. And so I think it is incumbent on society. Maybe it's not marketing's role, but maybe we can help push for it. But it's incumbent on society to educate the populace on what this data era is all about, and what that means to them individually, and what their rights are.
Absolutely. And I think even I've had conversations, and I know, you guys have done a lot of like mentorships and everything like that with, college level students, for people that are just kind of entering the marketing world, that have that perspective, that have also grown up with all this technology. You know what I mean? The consumers of today and the consumers of tomorrow have grown up with a smartphone. They've grown up with all of this. They very much understand. I think I was listening to a podcast the other day where somebody was literally talking about it, saying, oh, don't search for that, you're going to mess up your algorithm, because they understand innately that everything that they do online, especially online, is very much personalized to them. And now with Web3 coming out, I mean, we can really go into the rabbit hole here. But as the technology,
do they understand it, Meg, or is it? I think they have a nascent understanding.
Mm-hmm,
I think they have an understanding that there's an algorithm. I don't think they understand how many tentacles that algorithm actually has, and whether or not they want those tentacles.
I agree. I think maybe it's like a close-up version. They haven't stepped back and seen, all of the different ways that bleeds into all of their other experiences, right? And I think that with brands also that are really have challenged themselves to give back that really personalized customer experience in the positive light, we've also touched up against like the boundaries and of where that's to Big Brother. Okay, that's made them uncomfortable, so then that has a negative impact on your brand, like what Alban was talking about before. But Angelia, I'm curious, for customer or for brands specifically that are looking to continue with that vastly personalized customer journey, what advice would you give to them under the lens of data civics and under the lens of, data protection and ethical data use?
I actually love personalization, but I do find the management of it to be onerous, which is back to the data civics conversation. I believe that for me, personalization introduces to me products that many times align with what I'm looking for. I wouldn't say it was a 90%, but maybe 50, 60%. Things that I was looking for that I didn't know existed. And so from that perspective, it's beneficial to me. However, we haven't gotten to the point where it is more precise, because there's still a lot of junk and fluff that gets presented to me, and it begins to feel intrusive. And so I know, because I'm in marketing, I know that there are things that I can do to manage that influx. But for me, I just kind of take the good with the bad. And so from your perspective about advice, I believe that when we throw things out there, when you have these conversations about who is it you're targeting, you target these big nets of people, because we work on numbers, right? Volume. I think as we move into this space and things become even more and more capable, as marketers, we want to be more and more precise. And instead of going volume, if I get 10,000 people, I get 2,000 leads. I think we need to begin to challenge ourselves to say, well, how do I get 1,000 leads by going after 5,000 people? How do I get 1,000 leads by going after 2,000 people? Because we have the data to do it. We just need to be more intentional about how we go out, how we collect it, and how we push our message out, how we design that campaign. Yeah,
and I want to jump on that. It goes back to this idea of investigation. I mean, the direct response community, again, I'm a little biased, but it's the original measurable media in my experience. And it was a fairly principled way to drive towards, as the technologies behind data management grew and changed, it was a way to target more of that precision. But I think there's something to adapt there to be able to kind of lower the biases and the thresholds of noise, is the fluff that you're talking about. And I do think brands are getting better at it, because there is a way to leverage first-party data for that accurate, scalable approach, especially when you consider the digital ecosystem. And I do think to make it run best, to make sure that those messages are received by, the intended target, but with this additional idea that they're in the consent matrix deeply. They understand that this is part of the exchange of, the promise and delivery of this customer, of this exceptional experience at their discretion. The amount of data, and as you say, the tentacles expand. And I do think, can't hammer that one home enough, I don't think, because there are a lot of things looming. The marketing community, to its credit, has done things. Google is announced the deprecation of the cookie for an alternate, but it is trying to at least, that's its own discussion, but they're trying to kind of come up with a way to sort of take some of the anonymity, bring back this idea that the consumer understands he or she is getting targeted. Specifically, the change in iOS 14. There are so many things happening under the hood to kind of drive towards what I think we're kind of talking about, this kind of consolidated view of like truly data civics, but it's the stewardship idea of a brand possessing data at the discretion of their consumers and using it in this responsible way with full notice and disclosure about precisely how that's used, and then give the consumer that choice. I think that is going to rise and become increasingly paramount.
It's maybe to go back to that idea of data civics. Basically, I think we still have a lot of disparities in the overall population, whether it's in the US, in Europe, or elsewhere in the world, actually, as to what people actually understand of data collection. Whether it's my parents, that I still like mystified when they get, a targeted ad basically online in a way, or whether it's even my nieces and nephews that are just teenagers, and starting to get on the internet. They don't really know what's behind it. They have a basic understanding that by what they search, they influence like what's being presented, but they don't really know what's behind it. And we even see it whenever there's a scandal linked to data privacy, right? Most marketers are like, well, obviously they were collecting your information, but for a lot of the audience, it's brand new information, or they didn't realize that it was to that level. And at the end of the day, maybe they have some far-fetched conception. And actually, I've heard both from different consumers. Some of them are surprised that we don't know more about them, and they're expecting very, very, very like individual personalization. Basically, I'm a fan of this tech company, basically, and I bought their computer at this time and their phone at this other time. They should know which devices are active. They should know like what type of stuff I like, and they should like target the offers based on that. And people are surprised we're not to that level yet, which is, I guess that's one fraction. And then there are the ones that just don't really, they have a basic understanding of what we're doing in the background to get them to be interested in our products, in our services, but don't really know more. So I think that there's a real question there. And to go back to the terms and services, in my thesis, I actually referred to a test that a video game company did with their terms of user terms of usage. Basically, they had a clause about surrendering their immortal soul, the user surrendering their immortal soul to the company, and there was an opt-out like in the terms and conditions basically. And if they clicked on it, they basically got money back on their video game. I think there was only one person who actually found it in like the thousands and thousands and thousands that signed the terms and condition. So for sure, I don't read them. And I think that, and you know, I have a little bit of a low background. I think a lot of people don't because they're just too complicated. So yeah, how do we make that more transparent and more understandable? I think it's a big question as marketer and as a society.
Definitely. And I think it kind of goes to, again, like Apple, right? I think they're a really great example of, you know, with their latest update, this is very clearly, very legible, one sentence. Do you understand that you're giving this app permission to collect your data? And it's disrupted a lot of stuff from the data and technology and for marketers that are using that to build out their campaigns. But from a consumer perspective, how much brand trust? I'd be curious, and I don't know, and I'll do a fact check on this later. What were the stats for consumer response to Apple as a brand that got reinforced with that customer base? It was like they were serving the consumer versus serving the advertisers. You know what I mean? So with Google, Joe, like you were talking about before, it's, yes, the deprecation of cookies and trying to find another balance because they do serve advertisers. So how do they also walk that line? And how do we as marketers put our human hats on and be like, would I be comfortable with this if this were my kids, if this was, you know, my information? And then again, like it all goes back to education and finding a way to make even the education about the process more human and more digestible to someone who doesn't do this every day, all day, like the rest of us do. But Alban, I'd be curious for brands that kind of want to understand more about that perception from the customer. Maybe not even brands, but just marketers in general. Where would you tell them to start to even look to try and find that out?
If they're not doing anything in terms of, you know, social listening, data collection, I think most marketers do, hopefully. But if you're really not doing anything and you want to have a basic understanding, you know, even just a simple alert tool on your brand name and your product names, you know, can be, and there are, you know, free tools around it, including, you know, from Google Alerts to TalkWalker Alerts, actually, if we have to name some, but even some basic listening on a day-to-day basis, feeding your team of like how people are talking about your brand, your product is super useful. For my team, actually, that's what we do even for our brand, in a sense. We have a connector basically directly into our Slack channel. It's called, you know, and we get anything that's that happens, any earned mention, basically, we see it come through, and then we have it segmented by regions. It's actually really interesting because we can, you know, like discuss it straight into Slack and rebound on it. So it's quite organic. Obviously, we look at it bigger picture at the end of the month as well, but it does help in a lot of way and be, you know, keeping our finger on the pulse of the market in a sense. So that's quite interesting. I would say that's the first basic step. In a broader sense, even if you're already doing some sort of, you know, listening already to what consumers are saying, you know, to understand your perception, I would say understand what data is available across your organization, because that's super important. I think Joe was alluding to it earlier. We have a lot of first-party data available within the organization that we're not leveraging in the best way. Maybe customer success, you know, like getting some insight out of surveys, but do you have access to these? You know, can you feed that, you know, and cross that with your earned mention, maybe in terms of brand? Which data do you have access to, and how can you make sense of it, basically? Because I think that's it's very easy to get drawn in data. How do you make sense of it? How do you use it to help you in a decision making on a day-to-day basis? Whether you're head of brand like I am here, or whether you have another function, whether you're trying to decide what you're going to do in terms of SEO strategy on your market. It can be a lot of things.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. The people that aren't always doing like that social listening, or maybe the people that haven't thought about it or don't know how to do it the right way. I've heard some companies, even just the language that they're using, trying to really go through and figure out what type of language they're coming out in the comments so that they're using the same terms that their customers are using in their marketing messages. Things like that, I think, have been just another layer of data that I think people aren't as familiar with understanding how to use it in their storytelling, which is why I love your title. Can you actually tell us, we have some time, so can you actually tell us how you developed your own role? Because I just think it's super interesting and I think everybody here would benefit from it.
Definitely. So, well, I started TalkWalker as, a basic field marketer on the French-speaking market in Europe, then, went to the US and all that. But when I came back to Europe, I'm lucky enough to be a big fan of the platform and an avid user of TalkWalker as well, because I just think, cultural insights are fascinating, to be honest. And I was feeling like we weren't getting enough, enough help from the client-facing team in terms of getting interesting insights, really getting deep into the platform. And I felt like we could infuse more storytelling, more data storytelling, actually, in all of the marketing initiatives we're doing. So that's how I created, the storytelling team, basically. Platform experts that really dig deep into TalkWalker, trying to understand, identify new consumer trends from, like how people are talking about air fryers, and we found out that actually it was very often linked to their favorite streaming platforms. Apparently, air fryers and streaming platforms are a huge thing, and people really enjoy the two together. It's apparently the recipe to happiness for a lot of consumers, which was super interesting. But yeah, it's quite good. But I would say that in the end, to actually tie back my role to what I was saying about the need to listen really deeply, brands often don't define themselves anymore, and products are used in ways that maybe they didn't anticipate. I would say that sometimes your products lead a secret life that you're not aware of if you're not listening very closely to what your consumers are saying, basically. And that can be through text, but it's also through images. Obviously, visuals are a huge part of social right now. And it's also, so listening to text mention, understanding how your logos are being used, in different images. There's just a wealth of intelligence out there that a lot of people just don't have access to right now.
I think there's a lot of subtlety that when you compile and aggregate this much data through these experiences, that investigation process either confirms things brands think they know, or it reveals, to your point, Alban, brand new insights and connections. And because of the volume, those micro failures, there's also these micro shifts in attention that can be examined and investigated in the same way. And when you kind of apply that philosophy of investigation across first-party data, sort of principled in a systematic, principled way, a lot kind of comes out of that in my experience.
Now,
Absolutely.
I also want to hit on what Alban said about images, the value of an image as data. I think that we are set up to have traditional data, right? Information in cells. But when we look at, because the internet is becoming so much more visual, and I think that goes back to us saying, these long privacy documents, no one wants to read them, right? People are going through all of this data visually. But I think we as brands, for the most part, miss most of that activity, because we're able to collect the words, anything that is a traditional data stream. But I think there are probably some brands out there who are doing, but most brands are missing the images.
I agree.
The images, the video, even the speech, to be honest. And I'm not talking, obviously, we're only talking about public data here, but discussion in podcasts or webinars like this one is huge and can actually have a huge impact on the brand. So it's really something that we're seeing, it's really not just text anymore. It's, logo detection, object detection, in public images and video, like really understanding the broader context. And sometimes you have really unusual associations, you know? I mean, I had the air fryer and string platform example, which wasn't obvious to me straight away, though I do not own an air fryer, so maybe that's my issue at a personal level. But yeah, that visual life of brands and products is really fascinating, to be honest.
And I also think the other thing is, you know, we talked about images, but also the speed to which perception changes. You know what I mean? I think everybody's attention span, we know, is shorter than ever, but I think the way that point of views change, as, you know, we're seeing with, you know, the cultural conversations that are out right now, with what's going on in the Ukraine right now, with everything that's hitting the news, it's really interesting to see how brands are interacting with that, how they're reacting to that, how they now have a voice and a say in that, where I feel like in years past, if they did, it wasn't necessarily what it looks like today. So I think, again, like the adoption of all of this, you know, technology and this advancement in data is also giving us more room to react sooner than we were able to before. And how the customer perception actually, how that hits with them as well. So Alban, you know, we talked a lot about, you know, the state of data today. We talked a lot about like data civics. I want to kind of jump now into like the future of data and technology and where we're going, because I feel like we're in the future now. Like we've jumped in the time machine. We've gotten, you know, 2 years ahead of time, which I think we probably wouldn't be here if it hadn't been for what happened in the last couple of years. I think we're further along than we thought we would be in 2022. So the future, I feel like, is almost arrived, but it's still speeding up. So with the adoption of all of this new technology, and it's only going to be becoming more advanced in the next coming years, what are you particularly more excited about seeing the evolution of in terms of data and marketing technology today? Well, tomorrow.
Lots of things. Right now, I'm a bit daydreaming about artificial intelligence, to be honest, and the list of advances. As I said, there's just so much data out there, and I think that as marketers, in order not to drown in it, in order not to spend countless hours doing what you were describing, Angelia, you know, just filling boxes, you know, filling Excel sheets and trying to make sense of that, we need more automation, you know, to make sense of it, help us surface what's relevant to us. I think that's often something we struggle with. We're marketers, so we could be doing 10,000 different things every single day, even if we had more than 24 hours. But how do you focus on what really matters? You know, how do you surface like what's relevant to your team now to be agile in terms of decision making? And I think the way forward is with, you know, artificial intelligence to help guide us through data, basically. And there's some really interesting things happening in this space in terms of, you know, prediction, especially, that I'm excited. So I think we'll see a few developments on that front this year. So quite excited in that respect in terms of data and technology.
Absolutely. As we think about like the new technologies, we're also looking at new environments, right? New ways and places, virtual places that we're now able to kind of interact with consumers and prospects and customers now. And Angelia, you and we actually first connected on this when we started talking about metaverse and what that's going to look like, and how that's going to change the game for some more traditional marketing strategies that are in place now. So what effects do you think the metaverse is going to have on tomorrow's marketing strategies?
I believe that, so the metaverse is still, if anybody who remembers cloud, right? There have been so many definitions of cloud over the years. And I think the metaverse is in that space where it's not quite, there's no one accepted definition. There's multiple definitions. The definition that I like the most is the one where we look at the individual. This space is going to give us individual to individual capability. And when I say individual to individual, I think a lot of times because we're big brands, we think brand to brand. But I think customers are going to be looking at us more and more and asking us to give them individual to individual. So I want to individually interact with my sales rep who is at that organization. And we're both creators in this space. I'm creating whatever it is I'm creating with your products, and you are a creator that's helping me create better. And I think it is a new mindset that we're going to have to take on. And I think we're going to have to take it on as this, we talk about it being in virtual spaces. I think that in virtual spaces is an advanced form of gamification. I don't think that, I think the virtual spaces are important. I think it's going to be a huge market. And I think it is the place that we are moving primarily today. But I think this hybrid space where you're physical and virtual at the same time is a space that's really going to be the space moving in the future. And so this creator behavior is going to have to go across both of those spaces. And that's what I'm excited about. And I didn't finish answer your question. That's what I'm so excited about. And as marketers, I think we have to begin to, most of us have always had an inner creator. But we have to begin to leverage that inner creator more than we have in the past as we move into these hybrid physical and virtual spaces.
I agree with that. And I've said this for years. Marketers are probably some of the most creative minds out there. You have artists, you have creators, but marketers are creators. And I think we very much thrive in that space. From my perspective, I'm seeing a lot more, because we have all these different silos in marketing, right? Which is why we created Coffee and Conversions to begin with, to try and start to merge these worlds together. We have data, and we have traditional direct marketing, and we have like digital marketing, and then we have strategy, and we have brand voice, and we have actual creative and content and communications and all of that. And I think this new world that we're moving towards is everybody is at a piece of all of it. And I think marketers that are probably more into the visual components and design are really paying more attention to data that's informing that now. And I think the new world for metaverse and where we're heading is, I really feel like those worlds are colliding. I'm just going to leave that as open to the whole panel if they have any thoughts on that as well.
I mean, I absolutely agree. And I think, I've been in, to Joe's point, or at the very beginning, I've been in this industry for a long time. If we don't, our young people, I'm older, our young people are demonstrating to us what it's going to look like. We need to pay attention. The reason that they are paying thousands and thousands of dollars for what I would consider to be a hideous piece of digital art. That's my perception. However, I don't believe these young people are purchasing based on aesthetic value. They're purchasing based on community. Back to that creator to creator mindset. You're a creator, I'm a creator. I value your creative delivery or your creative product here. I value the work that you put into it. I see beyond just the bits and bytes that are on the screen. And I'm going to pour into you. Now, the financial community has come in and created what I think is going to be a bubble. But when these younger people started, it was about value. It was not this cost-based thing that we do today. It was about how much they value the relationship, and they value what what that other creator put into the marketplace.
That's super interesting. And I think on top of that, what you're saying between, the metaverse and the physical world colliding in a sense, I think it's going to impact even the in-store experience and everything we have around us, because in a sense, it's a bit like what we're experiencing with the back to the office movement right now. People are still looking for physical, in-person experience, but you have to make it worth their time. And yeah, it's the value behind it. It's the experience. It's like, what you create with them in the office, in the stores, it's the added value that you bring to the table. So if it works in whichever form the metaverse will take, great, but if you want them to come to you in person, they will, if you provide something exceptional, basically something that will really delight them in a sense.
It's about kind of back to that customer experience and active participation. And I think the metaverse, to your point about creators and participating in creation and benefiting from creation, is sort of another shift in mindset about kind of the utility of the space. And we're at early phases, but there are some projections about its overall value, and it starts to cycle up into practically unimaginable numbers, but marketers will certainly start to understand if the bulk of their next best customers tends to dwell in these spaces, sort of how to connect in that and create more of the participatory model in a sense. And I think with that comes back this idea of a clear relationship about the data I'm collecting about you and how I'm using it and whether you want to participate in that.
And yeah, to bring that back to, you know, what we've seen over time, you know, beyond just the trend of the metaverse, but it's what we're seeing. I feel like generation after generation, yeah, it's the media where consumers spend the most time, like change the way they look at everything else, basically. So if it ends up that people spend most time in the metaverse, it will change the way they deal with everything else in their life. Same way as, you know, Facebook changed a lot of the way we interact. Facebook and Google changed the way we interact with the world around us. So, and TikTok is probably changing that a bit right now, in a sense. So to take really obvious example right now, but I think that's the next stage potentially for the metaverse, changing the way we see the world a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's really exciting that we're kind of seeing and being informed, right? Like Angelia and Joe were talking about before, by this next generation of marketers, but also consumers. I know I've been in conversations with other people that are really having their interns come in and do a lot of brainstorming and more projects than they ever have before at companies where they might not have had that same leeway 5 years ago, 3 years ago, because they just want to see what they want to come up with. And again, as marketers, I feel it's our responsibility to really nurture that as well. And Joe, I know that you're very much involved in that aspect of educating and mentoring young marketers in the industry, the next generation, as they continue to like hone their skills. And they've experienced this tech boom their entire lives. They're very familiar with kind of how that feels. As this generation is entering the workforce, what advice would you give to marketing leaders that desire to really leverage that perspective?
I think we have a lot to share in terms of understanding. The notion of theoretical learning in the marketing discipline is valuable. There are some basic principles about kind of understanding broadly the idea of consumer behavior as one example of many, but there's so much more applied learning now. I have the privilege of serving on the board of the marketing department at Rutgers Business School. And it's been such an eye-opening experience having had the privilege of mentoring executives, mentoring students, to bring it now down to the curriculum level, where the schools are very interested in making sure that the value of an investment in education is worthwhile. And one of the interesting sea changes, Google recently announced a fairly substantial investment in propping up its certification program. So if you balance out the need for a degree versus the need for a certification program, employers in various sectors of marketing and other areas are starting to value those certifications differently than they may have. Maybe for professionals in market, it would be a bolt-on to an existing resume, but for emerging professionals, these have cachet and value. So part of what we try to do in the Rutgers example, which is again just been such a cool experience to be a part of, is to work with emerging students about real world problems. We stood up a case study last year, as by way of example, challenged a bunch of groups of MBAs to basically dissect the deprecation of the third-party cookie. And if you were advising a brand on making specific shifts in market, maybe having leveraged a lot of your outbound acquisition efforts on utilizing cookies, how would you do it and what would you do? And because these students are participating actively in the technology, you know, and to your point about gaining those perspectives increasingly from new hires or interns about just how they're looking at the world, we were able to solicit about 17 teams from 10 schools to provide solutions and how to solve this problem. And they all tackled them very, very differently. And we were able to provide the prompt and to provide some guidance and some judging about, hey, consider things like budget, consider the hard costs of implementing marketing, consider the reputational costs of marketing in sort of a way that's a little askew of maybe honing in on that consumer sentiment, which we now have the ability through technology to really, really fine tune at various points if we're listening well. So I think as marketers invest in this upcoming generation, especially, you know, you gain experience someone who's had the pleasure of mentoring, I learn more from the big secret is I learn more from the people I mentor than I probably could ever actually teach them, because the perspectives are so enriching, and it gives me pause for thought, sends me down pathways and directions to just become more educated and more capable marketer in terms of just applied learning of all of what's changing, because they have firsthand exposure as users, creators, participants. So I would say I would fully endorse, and if anybody's interested after this, reach out to me. I'm happy to kind of give you a little bit. If you're interested in exploring this more, I know I have a few venues I can point to help you kind of exercise that and learn if it's something you're interested in. But I think it's essential, especially after the 2 years we've just gone through. And students, and I have 4 nieces and nephews, all of whom are college age, and they have struggled. They have struggled on the heels of emerging from the pandemic. Their college experience specifically is radically different from what I experienced and others experienced. So that investment to try to do what you can to help them navigate this, but then simultaneously you will benefit from their abundant insights and creativity in terms of applying marketing lessons back into your own practices. And I think you will get additional insights into their perceptions of how this exchange for the experience and the data exchange actually is happening in their minds, and give you pause for thought about thinking of realigning messages, improving on messaging around that. It's a great experience, but the investment as professionals back in that community, absolutely essential, in my opinion.
Awesome. And I agree 100%. And I know that, the group here fully invests in that as well. I do want to get to a question from our audience. We have, do we think the scale and or quality of data collection might be influenced by the international threats of cyber attacks, perhaps with consumers behaving more cautiously while online? Great question, Shauna. Thank you so much for asking. Panel, what do you have?
I was waiting for Joe because I thought that question was coming right down his street, but I would say yes, absolutely. And I think it goes back to data civics and us helping people understand how, because most people know they don't really know how to protect their data. And while Russia doesn't really care about me, right? Russia, China, Europe, whoever, they don't really care about me. There's 7 billion people on the planet. They don't care about me. However, in that big shovel of data that they scoop up, they may scoop up my data, and most people don't really know how to protect their data. So
a resounding yes. Caution, and back to this idea of lessons learned about how valuable would it be to certain populations to understand how to spot a scam, how to make sure you're equipped with the tools you need to understand when there are things, kind of unsavory things happening. Absolutely, and I do think the current state of affairs in the world might give more people and consumers pause for thought as to how they interact. But at scale, I don't know. I feel like marketers have done. They've done a good job of building that consumer trust. Many marketers have, and I think it's building on that, especially now in identifying things like cyber threats as part of that renewed commitment. I think brands can absolutely acknowledge that and work with their customers to build confidence and to build and to grow, the education around how to precisely look at these things differently, so that they don't get caught up as much in the shovel of data, maybe.
Maybe to add another perspective to it, so obviously there's the consumer aspect, being more careful about their data, which I really hope is going to happen more and more. And again, we go back to data literacy based on different populations in the world and different generations as well. But also from a brand perspective, I think there's something to be done there. And we go back to noise, content refinement, the ability to identify bots. So the data data quality is something very important, Just a few years ago, we were talking quite a bit about fake news. Well, very much so. Now we call it misinformation, with the pandemic and all of that. But it comes in all kinds of contexts. It can come in the context of cyber threats as well. So being, data quality being an imperative within marketing teams is going to be important as well, I would say, in that respect, in this context of cyber threats. And in terms of carriers, since we were talking about carriers, I think that, as marketers, we have to remain curious and always better informed, and I think that cybersecurity is something quite interesting, actually, that, if you're looking to learn more, or if you're a student right now in college, that's something that definitely I would take a few courses in, because, it's definitely going to be a big concern for whichever company you end up working for.
Absolutely. Well, team, that is all we have for you today. Thank you all so much for your time. Joe, Angelia, Alban, you guys were a true pleasure. This was so much fun, and you are invited back anytime to the coffee table. Coffee Insiders, go ahead and make sure you subscribe. What we are doing with all of our guest panelists, any information that they publish or share that we find interesting, we will make sure to share it with the group. Thank you all for joining Coffee and Conversions. And until next time, have a good one. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye.